Welcome to chapter number 6, the Gospel of John. You see here the outline, the basic outline of the Gospel. This follows that's in your books. And so we're going to just walk down through this kind of briefly here. You can read more detail in your textbook by going to this chapter. We see the prologue in the first part of the book. Very interesting prologue. It's a great area to study in the gospel on the Logos and do a paper on what the Logos means and so forth. Very fascinating. We see in the next big section is the disclosure of Jesus in word and deed. We have the prelude to his ministry, his early ministry, and then the performing of signs and works and words and rising conflict. We see in the transition period from chapter 11 through chapter 12, in this period we have the death and raising of Lazarus, then the decision that Jesus has to be killed, and then the prelude to the Passion narrative. The last half of the book is Jesus' self-disclosure on the cross and his exaltation. Here we see the Last Supper, the farewell discourse, Jesus' prayer for his disciples, the trial and passion of Jesus, and the resurrection, then the epilogue. Now the external evidence, Theophilus of Antioch, is the first to unambiguously refer to the fourth gospel as explicitly ascribing John as the author. This is on your quiz this week. Quotations from John without reference to authorship are also found in Tatian, Claudius, Apollinarius, and Athenagoras. The external evidence, we see Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, is over in modern-day Turkey. He was bishop in Smyrna, was in Asia Minor, of course. And he was martyred in 156 at the age of 86. And you can read the account of his martyrdom. It's very fascinating that as he was brought before the Roman officials, they said, now look, old man, just renounce Christ and you can go home and die in peace in your bed. And he said, my Lord has never forsaken me once, and I will not in this, the final hour, deny him. And so they burned him at the stake. The onlookers said that when he was being burned, that it had the smell of incense going up into the heavens as God was pleased with his sacrifice. Interesting, great story. He personally knew the Apostle John. His testimony about John is relayed by Irenaeus, who knew Polycarp personally. Most likely, he's referring to John in his testimony, at least in Irenaeus' opinion. The beloved disciple, the author of the fourth gospel, was John the Apostle. External evidence, we see second century church fathers that clearly thought John, son of Zebedee, wrote the fourth gospel. This includes Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Clement of Alexandria. Now, those who did not accept the authenticity of the Gospel of John were known as the alogoi, the witless ones. Some rejected John because they felt it had affinities with other heretical sects like the Montanists. And I believe you have a question defining the Montanists this week as well. Well, here's the quote from Papias, and it's found in Eusebius's History of the Church in 3.39. He said, if anyone chanced to come who had actually been a follower of the elders, keyword, I would inquire as to the discourses of the elders, what Andrew or what Peter said, or what Philip or what Thomas or James or what John or Matthew or any other of the Lord's disciples, and the things which Aristion said and John the elder, disciples of the Lord, say. Now, Eusebius interprets this Papias' words to mean that there were two Johns, John the Apostle and John the Elder. But while Eusebius distinguishes between apostles and elders, Papias does not. Papias calls John the Elder because he intends for John to be grouped with the aforementioned elders. Papias makes distinctions here between first-generation witnesses who have died and those who are still alive. Eusebius uses this to distance the book of Revelation from the Apostle John out of his distaste for its millenarianism. So, he has a hidden agenda, it seems. It's not certain that there was ever an elder John, apart from the apostle, who did age and became an old man. If we take the book of Revelation to be in the 90s, mid-90s, he would have been an elder. The author was likely a Jew. The Dead Sea Scrolls evidence that many of John's characteristic expressions were from a Palestinian Jewish first century setting, so there's really no need to posit this Hellenistic influence. For example, in the first chapter, when he talks about the Logos, that was a clear Greek Hellenistic concept, and so critics of the gospel have said that it was just a Hellenistic influence that that generated the writing of this gospel. But some of John's quotations of the Old Testament are closer to Hebrew than they are to Greek. So, what are the internal evidence? Who's the beloved disciple? Is there a connection to authorship here? The beloved disciple is present at the Last Supper. The synoptics claim that only the 12 are present, but distinguished from Peter, but also cannot be confused with the other disciples mentioned in John 13 through 16. So he's one of the 7 who go fishing in John 21. He's not Peter, Thomas, or Nathaniel. Can't be James, since the beloved disciple was apparently still alive when the gospel was written. John or one of the 2 unnamed disciples. It has to be. The fact that James and John are not mentioned anywhere in the 4th gospel by name is very strange, unless the author is deliberately not using his own name. The companionship of the beloved disciple and Peter makes sense in the light of John's and Peter's close friendship, as attested elsewhere in the New Testament. Internal evidence. John, the son of Zebedee, is the author. John lived for many years in Judea and abroad, so there's little reason to suggest he would have focused more on Galilee. John, the son of Zebedee, is the author. Acts 14:13 refers to Peter and John as untrained laymen. That is in no way means that they were illiterate. They're trying to say that there was another John in that episode. The fact is, Jewish boys learned to read, and John's family was likely well off financially. The evidence suggests that first century Palestinians were bilingual, even trilingual. There's no reason to suggest that the Apostle John couldn't have written fluent Greek. The phrase beloved disciple is not an indicator that Jesus loved John more. Most likely, according to Carson and Moo, it's a reference that he had a profound grasp of God's grace in Christ. The structure and style of John are so uniform that source and tradition critical theories on John are very hard-pressed to make anything other than highly speculative hypotheses. The tradition is far more elegant. So, another problem. Why does the author have so little distinction between his own work in shaping the story and the words of Jesus? What they mean, what they're asking is, there are about 150 words placed on Jesus' lips that are never used elsewhere by the author. The verbatim quotation is not the only manner of fair and historically accurate reporting. John's writing as a preacher. In other words, he can use different words. Okay? So there are other methods of looking at historically accurate reporting. The author thinks of himself as a reliable intermediary of the events and the audience of the gospel. He is equipped by the Spirit for this task. On the second bullet point, it would be like saying that if we took our vocabulary from a sermon we preached on Sunday, and then just because of conversation we had, say, with a group of friends over a football game or something later in the week, just because that same vocabulary wasn't used in both places, they're trying to say that there were two different authors. Geographical provenance. These four places have been suggested: Alexandria, Antioch, Palestine, and Ephesus. Ephesus is the only location with any support at all in the Church Fathers. Some have suggested that the background
for the gospel
is from Philo, Jewish writer who lived
find these on the next
in
two
Alexandria
slides,
just before and during the time of Jesus.
In the text.
This is on your quiz.
Others
have said the Hermetic writings. These
questions.
were written teachings of Hermes,
Philo,
Trismegistus, and many affinities to the
it's been
Gnostic literature.
Proposed that the Logos in the prologue of John was a Stoic concept that is influenced by Philo. The Hermetic writings were written by Hermes Trismegistus. Many affinities to Gnostic literature. We'll define Gnosticism on the next slide. But those are two of the ideas. Let's look at two more. It's also been suggested that
Gnosticism influences. That's a general term that describes the Neoplatonic groups that regard the material world as evil, that knowledge brings salvation,
groups,
or perhaps the Mandaism, a peculiar Gnostic sect that likely originated in a Jewish baptizing sect.
This sort of thing.
Okay, all of these are going to be on your quiz, and you have definitions in your
This is
study guide.
sometimes and rightly described as amorphous theosophical hodgepodge. I would agree that Gnosticism is not the background to the gospel, and Mandaism is a peculiar Gnostic sect that originated as a Jewish baptizing sect, and they had the myth of descent called the knowledge of life. These type of influences have been suggested, and you can read on 256, 257 how Carson and Moo debunk most of this, and but it's, these are just attempts to really to discredit the gospel, and that's one of the reasons I love this text, because Carson gives you the apologetic ammunition that you need to combat these theories that are out there and being proposed and would like to combat the gospel. So you can read these. It's a really good section there in the text. Well, except for Philo, all of these are post-date John, so there's no evidence of any credibility that those other groups influenced John. The Dead Sea Scrolls have shown that John's conceptual world is at home within first century Judaism. That is, John uses language that is more universal and engages his readers in a pluralistic society for the purpose of evangelistic mission. So we see parallels to the synoptics, the Spirit's anointing of Jesus, the Baptist's baptism with water, Messiah's baptism with the Spirit, various sayings, Jesus' propensity toward nature metaphors, and the uniqueness of Jesus' sonship to the Father. These interlocking traditions, John reports of an extensive Judean ministry, Mark's assumption that Jesus taught day after day in the temple, the trepidation about the southward journey in
Jesus' ability to round up a colt and secure the upper rim. All of these are interlocking traditions.
So the interlocking traditions, the only explanation,
it's the only explanation to the synoptic account and the charge against Jesus that he threatened the temple is in John 2:19. John provides the reason that Jewish authorities brought Jesus before Pilate. Only John provides a reason that John was allowed into the high priest's courtyard.
Into the high priest's courtyard. So you see, John gives us a lot of the answers that to the questions raised in the synoptic traditions.
Other interlocking traditions, John's account of Jesus' call makes the synoptic account easier to understand. The synoptics explain why the trial of Jesus plunges into the Roman court. And Philip's hesitation to bring Gentiles to Jesus in chapter 12 can be explained by Matthew 10:5. So, it's likely that John read Luke and Mark, maybe even Matthew. John's not dependent on any of their accounts. He provides valuable historical insight that complements the synoptics. The dates. If it was written before 70 AD, the references to the temple and to the sheep gate are easily explainable by John's style and his addresses. Second view would date it between 85 and 95 during the reign of Domitian, after the Council of Jamnia in 85, and there's no mention of the Sadducees, which would point back to the destruction of the temple. That is, the temple was destroyed in 70, wiping out the Sadducees, so they were based in the temple. So if it's written in 85, that would explain why there's no Sadducees mentioned in this gospel. The prevailing understanding is a reconstruction of early Christianity. However, there's no legitimate reason to suggest the reign of Domitian. The theory of the break between Judaism and Christianity at Jamnia in 85 is and has been recently challenged. The prevailing understanding of early Christian history is subject to critique. For example, the closest theological parallel to John 1 through 18 are in the Christ hymns of Philippians 2 and Colossians 1, which were circulating in the 50s. There's no compelling reason to suggest an earlier date. A later date is verified by the Church Fathers. John's theological themes appear to be on a trajectory toward an unrestrained manner in which Ignatius uses them. It would be difficult to believe that John could have been written immediately after AD 70. Some time must be allowed between the writing of the Gospel and the Johannine epistles, which were directed toward a somewhat Gnostic misreading of the first Gospel. So, the proposals, is superseding or correcting the synoptics, that the Gospel is called forth and for the Johannine community. Muser calls for single themes in the purpose of the book, and there are other synthetic approaches. John 20:31 says that you may believe that the Christ, the Son of God, is Jesus. That's a great purpose. Many, most likely people that would have asked, who is the Christ, would have been the Jews. Many Old Testament allusions and quotations presume familiarity with these scriptures. In other words, if there's not this question about who Christ is, it's because the Jews knew the Old Testament quotes and so forth. The earliest fragment is P52, around AD 130. P66 contains John 1-14 and parts of the remaining chapters. P45 is 3rd century, contains all 4 Gospels plus Acts. So the earliest and most reliable manuscripts, interestingly, do not include John 7:53 to 8:11. Contributions of John. John adds depth to the portrait of Jesus' ministries, death, and resurrection. Jesus, as the Son of God, is in perfect obedience and subordinate to the Father. He emphasizes the cross and resurrection. His distinct emphasis is on inaugurated eschatology. John's Gospel is characterized by an extraordinary number of allusions and typological use of the Old Testament. There's also emphasis on how Jesus was misunderstood by his contemporaries and followers prior to the resurrection. Exploration into what it means to belong to the people of God. There's distinct vocabulary that speaks to important theological insights: death, life, light, darkness, these kinds of contrasts. The exploration of these complexities that bind together election, faith, and the function of the Son.